Welcome to the Crawlcast. I'm your host, George Krawczak, and this is what happened in Week 8 of the NFL season. So the first game of the season was first game of the week was the Los Angeles Rams versus the Minnesota Vikings. The Rams won 30-20. The Rams' leading passer was Matthew Stafford, who had 279 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Kyren Williams, who had 97 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Puka Nacua, who had 106 receiving yards. For the Vikings, their leading passer was Sam Darnold, who had 240 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Aaron Jones, who had 58 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Justin Jefferson, who had 115 receiving yards. So for this game, the Rams look like they're back. They're back on track. And believe it or not, getting your top 2 wide receivers will do that. And so overall, they are just a really good team. And yeah, because they were in almost every single game, even though they had a bad record, they were in almost every single game. And now they have Puka Nacua and Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp back. So the ending of this game, the Rams were up by 8, and the Vikings need to go 95 yards and score a touchdown and a 2-point conversion to tie it. Let's be honest, that probably was not happening, but there was a horrible face mask call, and the refs just blatantly missed it. This is my proposal, and this is my proposal for a long time, is I think that in the NFL you should have as many challenges as timeouts, and you can use them as many times as you want, in the sense that you're only allowed 3 incorrect challenges. And I think that works because if you're wrong, then you lose a timeout, and timeouts become very, very valuable, especially towards the end of the games. And the Rams are back on track. The Vikings, I'm still a little concerned about. Sam Darnold did look pretty good, but they lost Christian Darrisaw. And once they lost him, it seemed like things started to come unraveling a little bit. And then their defense just looked bad. I think the quick passing game is the way to beat the Vikings defense, but kind of they have those disguised looks. But if you don't even allow them to get in their disguised looks, then they can't. Then it doesn't work. But overall, I think you got to be really happy if you're the Rams. The next game is the Green Bay Packers versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Green Bay Packers won 30-27. Their leading passer was Jordan Love, who had 196 passing yards and an interception. Their leading rusher was Josh Jacobs, who had 127 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Tucker Kraft, who had 78 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Jaguars, their leading passer was Trevor Lawrence, who had 308 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher was Tank Bigsby, who had 78 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Brian Thomas Jr., who had 60 receiving yards and a touchdown. For this game, Jordan Love did leave early due to a groin injury. I guess it got really bad that he was struggling to move. So Malik Willis came in, and honestly, Malik Willis looked really good, and they saved the day. For this is why I'm so impressed with Matt LaFleur, because he knows how to change his offense, and that's a sign of a good head coach. Like, for example, look at what happened with the Dolphins. Tua goes down, and they completely crumble. They cannot do anything. And Mike McDaniel refuses to change his offense, even though clearly Tyler Huntley is not Tua. So, very impressed with Matt LaFleur, kind of changing it up and allowing Malik Willis to do well. Josh Jacobs played really, really great as well, kind of put the team on his back. And it is unfortunate that Love will probably miss the Detroit game next week, but overall, you gotta be very happy if you're the Packers. Then Trevor Lawrence, he actually played really well. Tank Bigsby played really well. Kind of both teams played really well in this game, even though the Packers did get the victory. And also, I think it was a heck of a signing by Brandon McManus. The Packers finally solved their kicker's issue. If their kicker has made 100% of their kicks, the Packers would probably be 8-0 right now. I get it, you can't exactly count on that because then it changes strategy and all that, but if, let's just say, flat out, kickers made the kicks and no other points are scored, then the Packers would be 8-0 right now. So overall, I think you gotta be very happy if you're both teams. Next game is the Detroit Lions versus the Tennessee Titans. The Lions won 52-14. The Lions' leading passer was Jared Goff, who had 85 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Jahmyr Gibbs, who had 127 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Sam Laporta, who had 48 receiving yards and a touchdown. And then for the Titans, their leading passer is Mason Rudolph, who had 266 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher is Tony Pollard, who had 94 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Calvin Ridley, who had 143 receiving yards. The story of this game was special teams, especially by Kalif Raymond, who had 5 returns for 190 yards and a touchdown. And then Khalil Dorsey for the Lions had a 72-yard kick return as well. And honestly, the Titans didn't play that bad in the sense that I feel like their defense really didn't reflect the score of the game. It's just that their special teams failed so tremendously that almost every single time the Lions got the ball, they were in the red zone. And then the Titans offense didn't play well. Mason Rudolph simply just didn't play well. The Lions, it does get me curious because I do think they need to trade for a pass rusher, but their offense has been so high powered and they've been kind of, I don't want to really say lucky, but they've been having such good luck on special teams and they haven't been facing a lot of great defenses. But once you kind of face more complete teams, that's when I think you're going to start running into issues with the pass rusher. So I do think they need to trade for someone to replace Aiden Hutchinson. But overall, the Lions looked really, really great. And then the Titans, just Mason Rudolph's clearly not the answer. And I think they at least need to give Will Levis I know Will Levis is injured, but we'll see if Will Levis can kind of turn it around. The next game is the Philadelphia Eagles versus the Cincinnati Bengals. The Eagles' leading passer was the Eagles won 37-17. The Eagles' leading passer is Jalen Hurts, who had 236 passing yards and 1 touchdown. Their leading rusher was Saquon Barkley, who had 108 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Devonta Smith, who had 85 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Bengals, their leading passer is Joe Burrow, who had 234 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher is Chase Brown, who had 32 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Mike Gesicki, who had 73 receiving yards. Overall, both teams looked pretty good. The Eagles just looked really great on offense. Saquon Barkley looked great, Jalen Hurts looked great, and Joe Burrow did struggle quite a bit at times in this game. And just overall, I do think there is quite a big concern for the Bengals just because of simply their division is so good and they need really every win to try to catch up. And the Eagles, just being at 5-2, feels like they're not playing their best football yet, but their defense has been improving slowly. Cooper DeJean has been playing better slowly. And so overall, I think you gotta be really, really happy if you're the Eagles. The next game is the Cleveland Browns versus the Baltimore Ravens. The Cleveland Browns won 24-29, or 29-24. The Cleveland Browns' leading passer is Jameis Winston, who had 334 yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Nick Chubb, who had 52 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Cedric Tillman, who had 99 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. And for the Ravens, their leading passer was Lamar Jackson, who had 289 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Derrick Henry, who had 73 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Zay Flowers, who had 115 receiving yards. Honestly, I hate to say it, but I think you're got to be very disappointed if you're the Browns, in the sense that this just shows more and more Deshaun Watson is the problem. Joe Flacco looked great when he was with the Browns. Jameis Winston looked great. Granted, it's only one game, but he looked great with the Browns. And Deshaun Watson has just looked terrible so far with the Browns. I get it, it's going to be about a year before Deshaun Watson can come back, but you cannot get rid of him due to his contract, and that's a problem. Because I don't know what you can do. Because of his contract, you really can't bench him. You definitely can't cut him or trade him. So, I hate to say it in the sense that you have to be a bit disappointed if you're the Browns, because you got to hope you're like, oh no, the whole team's terrible, and regardless of who's the quarterback, no one could pick this up. But no, literally feels like any quarterback can play well except for Deshaun Watson. But Jameis Winston did look really good, and good for him because he's been a backup for so long, and he did finally get his chance again. And Nick Chubb, he really hasn't been back on track so far. He really hasn't looked like his old self. He hasn't looked that great. And then for the Ravens, they looked really good. They just lost. It's plain and simple. The Jameis Winston outplayed Lamar Jackson and just played better. Plain and simple, and the Browns were a better team on this day. The next game is the Houston Texans versus the Indianapolis Colts. The Texans won 23-20. The Texans' leading passer is C.J. Stroud, who had 285 yards and 1 touchdown. Their leading rusher is Joe Mixon, who had 102 yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Stefon Diggs, who had 81 receiving yards. And for the Colts, their leading passer is Anthony Richardson, who had 175 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Their leading rusher is Jonathan Taylor, who had 105 yards and a touchdown, and their leading receiver was Josh Downs, who had 109 yards and a touchdown. So the Texans, I think, looked kind of average. Joe Mixon looked decent. C.J. Stroud didn't really do anything terrible, didn't really do anything great. It's just kind of average. But Anthony Richardson, he's kind of struggling quite a bit. His completion percentage is super low. And the one thing happened in this game that I don't think I've ever seen happen in my life, where Anthony Richardson was just tired, so he took himself out of the game. I've never seen that happen. And the next play of Joe Flacco was just a run play, so I think they could have just ran the ball with Anthony Richardson. But that was just shocking to me, because I get it, he was running all over, but you just have to have better cardio than that. Like, look at Lamar Jackson. He's probably the biggest running quarterback in the league, and he never misses a play. So Anthony Richardson just runs around for a little bit, and he needs to take a breather and check himself out of the game. I'm not happy with that. It reminds me of what really disappointed me of Deshaun Watson, where I saw as like losing respect, where it was a couple of weeks ago where the Browns wanted to go for it on 4th down, and Kevin Stefanski was holding up his fingers like, we're going for it on 4th down, and Deshaun Watson was just like, no, I'm walking off the field, we're kicking the field goal. It's kind of like that, where it's like, as a leader, you can't just say, hey, I'm tired, and just walk off the field. I just think that's a really bad look for Anthony Richardson. And the Colts he's not Anthony Richardson's just not looking good, and I think he's becoming a little bit of the problem. I think maybe what you want to do is put Joe Flacco in, because you're not out of the playoffs. Your division's not that great. And so I think, like I said, if you're the Colts, you might actually want to try to make a run of this at Joe Flacco. Let Anthony Richardson sit and learn, and then go with Anthony Richardson next year. That'd just be my piece of advice. And then Jonathan Taylor looked great. And Josh Downs has looked really good as well. The next game is the Arizona Cardinals versus the Miami Dolphins. The Arizona Cardinals won 28-27. The Cardinals' leading passer is Kyler Murray, who threw for 307 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is James Conner, who rushed for 53 yards and a touchdown. Their leading receiver is Trey McBride, who had 124 receiving yards. For the Dolphins, their leading passer was Tua, who had 234 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Devon Achane, who had 97 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Tyreek Hill, who had 72 receiving yards. So Kyler Murray finally broke the Call of Duty curse that has been haunting him for a while. And he actually looked pretty good in this game. He just feels like a streaky quarterback, where he has moments where he just looks really, really good. And that was this game. He kind of put the team on his back and looked really great. And then the Dolphins, their offense looks like it's back on track. Tua was clearly the problem, in the sense that not having him completely destroyed this offense. And even though they lost, I think you got to be really happy with the way things turned out with the Dolphins, in the sense that Tua's looking decent and your offense is at least back on track. Overall, I think you're kind of happy if you're both teams. And the next game is the New England Patriots versus the New York Jets. The Patriots won 25-22. The Patriots' leading passer was Jacoby Brissett, who had 132 passing yards. Their leading rusher was Ramondre Stevenson, who had 48 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Kayshon Boutte, who had 46 receiving yards. And then for the Jets, their leading passer was Aaron Rodgers, who had 233 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Breece Hall, who had 80 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Garrett Wilson, who had 113 receiving yards. The losses are just piling up for the Jets, and that's a problem. And here's the thing, the Jets actually played really good. In almost every single metric, I'd say the Jets were the better team today. And the only solution I have for them is probably cut Greg Zuerlein, because he's becoming a huge, huge liability for them. Just because they just can't miss kicks, this many kicks. Again, like I said, with the Packers, if Greg Zuerlein just made all his kicks and the scores ended there, the Jets would be 6-2 right now instead of 2-6. And it's hard to say any improvements because they are playing well. Their defense played relatively well. They struggled at the end there, but overall their defense played decent. Their offense played great, and there's really no more solutions. It's going to be very tough for them to make the playoffs. They basically need to get 9-8 record to make the playoffs. Right now they are at 2-6. They do have a pretty easy schedule if they want to do it, but overall they have to be 7-2 in the remaining 9 games, and I just think that's just going to be very hard for them to do. But who knows what's going to happen? And yeah, like I said, it's just tough because it feels like they're playing like situationally bad in the sense that in the whole game, one or the other, like the offense will play really, really good all game, and then once they need that one final drive, they screw up. Or the defense plays really, really good all game, and then once they need to stop them that one final time, they can't do it. So just overall, I think there's a lot of panic with the Jets, and I just don't think there's really any solutions. The next game is the Atlanta Falcons versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Falcons won 31-26. The Falcons' leading passer is Kirk Cousins, who threw for 276 yards and 4 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Bijan Robinson, who had 63 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Kyle Pitts, who had 91 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. The Buccaneers, their leading passer is Baker Mayfield, who had 330 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher is Bucky Irving, who had 44 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Cade Otton, who had 81 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. Kirk Cousins looked great, and the Atlanta Falcons offense looked really good. Bijan looked good. Like I said, Kirk Cousins looked great, and Kyle Pitts finally looked really good. Although he had this one very, very stupid play where he somehow dropped the ball. He stopped running, and then Antoine Winfield Jr. hit the ball out of the and it went out of the end zone. Luckily, for them, the refs didn't call it a fumble, even though it should have been. And just, I don't get how this happens. Like, honestly, every single player should be instructed, run to the end zone and then drop the ball. Don't let up. Don't just do the sprint, okay? If you score a touchdown, you're not going to be on offense anymore, so get a little break. Just run. I don't get it. It's literally child's work. You don't need to do that well. And then for the Buccaneers, I think they played really well. Baker Mayfield looked really good, all things considered, that they are struggling with a lot of injuries. And I think they got to be very happy being in this game, even though they are super injured. The next game is the Los Angeles Chargers versus the New Orleans Saints. The Chargers won 26-8. The Chargers' leading passer was Justin Herbert, who threw for 279 yards, 2 touchdowns. The leading rusher is J.K. Dobbins, who had 57 rushing yards and a touchdown. Their leading receiver is Ladd McConkey, who had 111 yards and 2 touchdowns. And then for the Saints, their leading passer is Spencer Rattler, who had 156 passing yards. Their leading rusher was Alvin Kamara, who had 67 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Chris Olave, who had 107 receiving yards. The Chargers looked really good in this one. Justin Herbert looked great. Ladd McConkey really had his first breakout game, and he looks like he's potentially going to be a stud because I've seen where he's having really good separation, but the ball's just not getting to him, plain and simple. And now that the Chargers are starting to get the ball to him, they're looking really, really good. And for the Saints, they're struggling with injuries. I think once Derek Carr comes back, they will be pretty decent. But I think starting Spencer Rattler was a mistake. I think they should have started Jake Haener and they should start him next week if Derek Carr doesn't come back. Just because Jake Haener seems like a better quarterback than Spencer Rattler right now, even though neither of them seem like really good options. Just overall, I think both. You also have to be happy that Alvin Kamara looks great and Chris Olave came back and looked great. But overall, you have to be very happy if you're the Chargers. Next game is the Buffalo Bills versus the Seattle Seahawks. The Bills won 31-10. The Bills' leading passer was Josh Allen, who had 283 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher is James Cook, who had 111 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Khalil Shakir, who had 107 receiving yards. And then for the Seahawks, their leading passer is Geno Smith, who had 212 yards and an interception. Their leading rusher is Geno Smith, who had 16 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Jackson Smith-Njigba, who had 69 receiving yards. Overall, the Seahawks offense just looked non-existent. They had zero rushing game. They Geno Smith looked fine, not great. The receivers didn't look good. And then Josh Allen, he really didn't play that great either, but just they had a really great rushing attack, and the Bills defense really just shut down the Seahawks. And I think that's what you got to be happy with if you're the Bills, because it feels like your offense has been kind of carrying the team, and now this is just showing, hey, you don't always need your offense to win these games. The next game is the Chicago Bears versus the Washington Commanders. The Commanders won 18-15. The Commanders' leading passer is Jaden Daniels, who had 326 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Brian Robinson, who had 65 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Terry McLaurin, who had 125 receiving yards. For the Bears, their leading passer is Caleb Williams, who had 131 passing yards. Their leading rusher is DeAndre Swift, who had 129 yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Rome Odunze, who had 41 receiving yards. Overall, Jaden Daniels looked pretty good in this game, and Caleb Williams kind of reverted to what he was before he kind of turned a corner, it felt like, and played really good, where he just didn't look good in this game. And then I do have to mention hold on. I do have to mention what is it? Ramondre Stevenson? Or, hold on. What? Well, yeah, Stevenson. The play with the Hail Mary. I don't know what he was doing. Why he was taunting, or actually Tyreek Stevenson. I don't know why he was taunting the crowd. He should have been paying attention to the play. I just don't understand what's going through your head there. The game's still going on, and you gotta try to stop it. He was supposed to box out the receiver that caught the touchdown, and then he ended up tipping the ball to him. I just can't explain it. It makes no sense. It was a terrible play. It just I just can't explain it. It's probably one of the dumbest plays I've ever seen, and it just was a horrible play by him. So overall, if you're the Commanders, you gotta be very happy, and if you're the Bears, you gotta be a little bit nervous because even though it's his rookie season, so he still has plenty time to go. So I wouldn't be too concerned about it. Caleb Williams is not really looking that great. The next game is the Denver Broncos versus the Carolina Panthers. The Broncos won 28-14. The Broncos' leading passer is Bo Nix, who had 284 yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Jaleel McLaughlin, who had 47 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Courtland Sutton, who had 100 receiving yards. And for the Panthers, their leading passer is Bryce Young, who had 224 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher is Chuba Hubbard, who had 56 rushing yards, and their leading receiver is Jalen Cocker, who had 78 receiving yards and a touchdown. So overall, this game, Bo Nix looked really good, and I think you gotta be very happy if you're the Broncos. Although every team looks good against the Panthers, so I don't know if that's really saying much about Bo Nix. But overall, this season, Bo Nix has looked pretty good. And then Bryce Young started out looking pretty good at the beginning, and then kind of fell off towards the middle and the end. I think if you're the Panthers, you just got to keep starting Bryce Young and hope he figures it out. I feel like there's no use to starting Andy Dalton. Feels like your season's over. You have no real hope, and just if you're the Broncos, you gotta be happy with a win. And then the Panthers, there's still cause for concern. This game really doesn't change anything. The next game is the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Las Vegas Raiders. The Chiefs won 27-20. Their leading passer was Patrick Mahomes, who had 262 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher was Kareem Hunt, who had 59 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Travis Kelce, who had 90 receiving yards and a touchdown. For the Raiders, their leading passer was Gardner Minshew, who had 209 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Alexander Mattison, who had 15 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Brock Bowers, who had 58 receiving yards. Patrick Mahomes did look better in this game. He's overall has had kind of a terrible season. He really is not looking good. And again, they haven't needed him to look good. Because look at this game. They held Alexander Mattison to 1.1 yards per carry. Gardner Minshew did look pretty decent. But overall, they just couldn't score in the red zone. And just the Chiefs' defense stopped the Raiders. And the Raiders just aren't a good team. And overall, I think you have to be happy with the Chiefs because Mahomes is looking better, And if Mahomes gets back to where he was a few years ago at MVP level, then the Chiefs could be unstoppable if they're really great defense. The next game was the San Francisco 49ers versus the Dallas Cowboys. The 49ers won 30-24. The 49ers' leading passer was Brock Purdy, who had 260 yards and 1 touchdown. Their leading rusher was Isaac Guerendo, who had 85 rushing yards and a touchdown. And the 49ers' leading receiver was George Kittle, who had 128 yards and a touchdown. And for the Cowboys, their leading passer was Dak Prescott, who had 243 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Ezekiel Elliott, who had 34 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was CeeDee Lamb, who had 146 yards and 2 touchdowns. So for this game, both teams looked decent. The 49ers offense really got back on track and looked great. And then Dak Prescott, even though he had those 2 interceptions, which one really wasn't his fault, but he played pretty well as well. And Brock Purdy, even though he wasn't amazing through the air, he looked really good with his rushing ability through the ground. And then the Cowboys, they're still struggling with zero rushing game whatsoever. Their passing game is working, and the 49ers basically just had 2 botched calls where they left CeeDee Lamb wide open. But just Dalvin Cook, Ezekiel Elliott, though they're just not the answer. I can't explain it. They're old, they're past their prime. And honestly, I don't care who it is. Just sign somebody, sign anybody to play your running back. Off of a practice squad, off of just anybody. Because clearly, these guys aren't working. They're too old. Just sign some young guy who seems fast and just try to plug them in and hope it works. There's no real good solutions. For the 49ers, they're looking good. They're still in their divisional race, and just kind of keep at it. Don't do anything different. And hopefully they'll just get more and more healthy, because right now they're severely injured. The final game of the week was the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the New York Giants. The Steelers won 26-18. The Steelers' leading passer was Russell Wilson, who had 278 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Najee Harris, who had 114 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is George Pickens, who had 74 receiving yards. And for the Giants, their leading passer is Daniel Jones, who had 264 yards and an interception. Their leading rusher was Tyrone Tracy, who had 145 yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Darius Slayton, who had 108 yards. So for this game, neither team really looked that great. Both defenses looked pretty dominant. Russell Wilson, he has been getting better and has looked pretty decent. And the main thing is he didn't really make any mistakes. He did have that one fumble, which nearly cost him, but overall he didn't really make that many mistakes. And George Pickens, there was one play in the back of the end zone where he just had to get his 2 feet down. It was kind of inexcusable, and he just didn't do it. Kind of poor foot control. Overall, the Steelers, their defense still looks great. Their offense is humming and getting better. And then for the Giants, Daniel Jones really didn't look good. They had one two-point conversion call, which just made no sense, where they had their whole offensive line lined up to the left, and they're going to run basically a screenplay. But for whatever reason, I don't know if the offensive line just didn't know the snap count or what, but nobody blocked, and the screen failed horribly, and Daniel Jones was very angry over that. But luckily for the Giants, Tyrone Tracy looks like a stud, and he's been doing really good. And overall, I think the Giants probably found a Saquon Barkley replacement, and their defense has been good. They just need Daniel Jones to play better. So that's what happened week 8 of the NFL season. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button like Doji Money. I'll see you on the next one.